please welcome to the stage Ben Holliday.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. Fantastic to be here in a dark room on the hottest day of the year with you. I think this is the cool room, so yeah, hopefully it'll be nice and comfortable for the next 45 minutes. But it's really great to be here. So yeah, thank you for the introduction. I've been working in public sector work for about 9 years now. So I work for an agency called TPX Impact, where I'm the chief designer. We have a design team of around 80 people working across service, product, content design and design research as well. Before that, I was head of design at the Department for Work and Pensions, which was an interesting experience for 4 years, and worked for the Government Digital Service briefly before that as well. Going way back, I worked in the private sector for the first kind of 12 years after studying graphic design, so I've worked across lots of different types of work in that time. The kind of theme for today, as part of TPX Impact, we launched as a new company this year, bringing together a number of companies that were part of a group that we were in, and the company that I was part of before. I've written a book called Multiplied. What I'd love to do today is just explore some of the ideas that are in the book, especially around this idea of multiplied by design. And really just to give you a brief introduction, because it is really hard actually to kind of bring to life what is quite a detailed book and lots of ideas in half an hour. But Multiply is really just the idea that it's possible to do more through our work. And it really does feel like a moment in time, and it was fantastic to hear Vim's talk this morning that we're at this kind of, I think, like a point of reflection where actually as we kind of come through urgent COVID response, like the world changing in the last couple of years, we now face a number of new crises, that ongoing things in our lives. And actually design and product and what we deliver and the work that we do through technology is all part of how we respond to that. Just to introduce that, I think this is a really important quote, and it's right at the start of the Multiplied book, and it's by Arne Nass, who was a Norwegian philosopher, but I really love this, and it kind of feels at the heart of what I kind of think of as a design mindset. And he said that claiming that something is impossible is nothing more than a temporary hypothesis. And it's this idea that 2 + 2 can equal 5 if something changes. And I really like this idea that the work that we do and the way that we work can actually become more, or it can equal more than the sum of its parts. And what I mean by that is actually when we think about, and it's fantastic, this is Agile on the beach, actually Agile ways of working, the way we think about multidisciplinary teams, the way we organize ourselves, the tools and the processes we use, the different skill sets we apply in these teams. All of this comes together to actually create something greater. And it's an idea I'm really kind of fascinated about, like how do we configure these things in order to actually deliver more impact through the work that we do? And again, it feels like we need more impact through the work that we do. Like in the public sector, we need better public services. We need policy that works for more people, that reaches everybody. So when I think of it, it's this idea of kind of multipliers. So what are the component parts that start to add up? And it's our people, it's how we work in teams, it's how we think about participations and not just our ideas, how we bring people meaningfully into the process with us. How that extends into inclusion and truly inclusive design. How we use research, how we use design, technology, data, and how all of that comes together in delivery. And the other one in there as well, like knowledge as a multiplier, how we work in the open, how we share, actually how we work collaboratively in order to make more possible. And it really comes down to this for me, that change is very much everything happening in the world. So we've all experienced COVID, lockdowns, kind of really affecting our day-to-day lives, like deeply personal situations that we can all draw from. But that was the first kind of a thing that was disrupting society. Like we were already a climate emergency before COVID hit us. We've already come through digital disruption in the last 10, 20 years. And really everything we do is like, how do we respond to change is the question. I wanted to include this slide because I think it's really important to recognize how people's expectations and needs are changing because of the way that everything is changing around us. Quite often I think about like, what are the things that start to define modern services? The things that start to push the expectations of actually what good looks like, what a modern, efficient service that becomes a good experience, delivers a good outcome looks like. And it is things like being more accessible, being more responsive, being more open, how we create more joined up experiences, Something I've thought about in the book as well is this idea of real time. How many public services really work in a real time way in the way that they use data, become more personalized or tailored to individual kind of needs. Automated transparency as well, like how do we build things around trust and consent for the modern world? And also faster and smarter. Like there were some fantastic questions already today about the role of AI and how we question and design being part of those processes. But also how do we start to create services that are smart, make the best use of technology? So lots and lots of themes that we could explore. But the thing I've got half an hour really today, and I'd love to just make time for some questions as well, so I will try and create time for some Q&A at the end. But really this idea that more is possible with design. And the reason I say that is really quite often design is the thing that's missing in my experience. And I would say that as a designer and as an advocate of design. But quite often, like we go about delivering technology, we go about delivering solutions without really involving design in the process. And I want to really explore how design adds value if we start to think about it in the right way. So I've got 6 examples to talk you through today. And I really wanted to try and be a bit more creative with the illustrations and the ideas here, just to kind of actually open up some conversations. These are really things that have shaped my understanding of design and really influenced kind of the work and ideas and how I've kind of tried to embed the work I do with teams over the years. So the first example is the art school. Have any of you ever been to the Glasgow School of Art Macintosh building while it was still standing in its original state? Like really sadly, there's been 2 major fires in this building in just over the last decade, and they're currently restoring it for the second time. But this is a fantastic example, and I've deliberately kind of looked at, what we might think of an art example, because it's really about connection and how great design starts to become more than the sum of its parts through the types of relationships that it builds. So the Glasgow School of Art is by Charles René Mackintosh, a very famous designer and architect. I got taken on a school trip here, I think in 6th form it was, so it'd be about 26 years ago now. And this building was finished over 100 years ago. But what's really kind of famous about it is just the level of detail of execution in terms of the modernist style. And very famously, I remember going on this school trip and we went to the library, which is this part of the building here. And it's this fantastically designed interior. And the interesting thing about Mackintosh is he didn't only design the exterior of buildings, he would work through every detail inside a building as well. So he designed the light fittings, he designed the furniture. Everything has some sort of connection in terms of the way the design fits together, which at the time it felt like a light bulb moment that actually everything could be considered, everything could have a relationship. And it's really this idea that actually great design starts to exist through this attention to detail. And I've read that it's basically been described that Mackintosh had this analytical precision, but with creative eyes. And I really love this idea that actually in terms of how we apply design thinking into our work, it could be analytical precision, which actually quite often we're really good at. If you do development engineering, the types of solutions we make, they're robust, they're scalable. We're good at precision, we're good at planning. But actually the creative eyes bit feels like, how do we start to combine those two things? And then in terms of how I would describe this, I really think of it as this word connectedness, which is a funny word, but actually I think it's this kind of intentional creative focus on details, how everything can hold some sort of relationship. And that's when good design starts to happen. And actually when things start to become more than the sum of their individual parts, the chair combined with the light fitting, combined with the design of the windows, how that creates light in the building, how people move through the space. And I actually think this can be the case as well. So you might be thinking, like, what's a building got to do with products and services? But actually, what if that level of detail, analytical precision with creative eyes, was applied to designing a housing system, the way that people access getting a home, the way the welfare system works, the types of relationships we build in providing support for people at key kind of stages of their lives in the public sector. So I think we can really start to apply that to any type of work we do. Just to give you one real example, and it's really hard with these kind of blueprints, but this is a big service blueprint for NHS blood and transplant that a team worked on at TPX Impact. And again, I mean, it's a really good example of connectedness. I've zoomed in on a couple of parts of it here. but not really thinking about how multiple products work together as part of this system of donating blood and other types of donation as well, but in a joined up way. Like traditionally, you'd have found lots of services existed within this ecosystem, but not in a very connected way, and actually leading to not great outcomes in terms of low retention numbers within people that do donate. So taking a joined up approach, thinking as well just about the type of marketing that needs to be in place, the type of community champions, everything happening offline as well as online. So that's connectedness. And example number 2, another example from the art world. So example number 2 is really this idea of the bull. And I don't know if anybody's seen this before, but I really like this example. So deliberately another example from the art world. This is the bull. It's by Pablo Picasso. Very famously, it's a series of drawings and studies where he was drawing a bull, and you can see at every iteration he was working through, making it, basically refining it, and this idea of actually trying to get it to the very essence of the image. And the final print, the final canvas, I think I counted it at some point, it's 5 lines in total. And you can still get the sense of clarity, what he's trying to communicate. And I've always kind of found these examples really fascinating. And it was described like this, like Picasso famously said, creativity, and this is kind of part of his work, it's this idea of not making additions. Actually, it's about making subtractions, and this idea that ideas need honing, simplifying, and focusing. And again, the value of design is when we start to actually bring in this process of how do we simplify, how do we do the hard work to actually focus, work out what's really important, strip things back to their core principles in order to create something that's clearer, that's simpler for people to interact with. So idea of simplicity, really important. Picasso, really interestingly, he described it as deconstruction, or actually in the kind of Spanish translation, it gets explained as either deconstruction or sometimes destruction as well, which I quite like, that design can be a destructive process. And it's the idea that sometimes we need to pull ideas apart. We need to question, we need to experiment in that way to find new ways, better ways of actually creating solutions that potentially communicate more clearly and more easy to access. And I wanted to kind of extend this because I don't think it's just simplicity. Sometimes it's easy to say like making things simple is easy because we just remove complexity. But I think a lot of this is really about curiosity. And my challenge would be like, do you really have curiosity in your teams? In terms of like, it doesn't really matter if you have people called designers or not, but is there that curiosity to actually question, break things apart, reconstruct things, look for different kind of variants of solutions that could be better? And so I think really it's smart business logic if we think about it in that way. So that takes me on to example number 3, and this is another one that has really shaped my thinking and that I really like, the space rocket. A very famous example about Elon Musk, who's been in the news a lot this year, less so recently, but I think he's still acquiring Twitter, so we'll see how that goes. But very famously, he's talked about this idea of working from first principles. And for me, it feels very much like a kind of design mindset, and very famous story. So it's said that Elon Musk went to Russia, went to try and buy a rocket, and they quoted him a kind of astronomical fee at the time. And on the flight back, he basically worked out the component costs of what it would take to build a rocket. He broke it down. So he said, you know, what do I need? I need aerospace grade aluminium alloys. I need titanium, copper, carbon fiber. And he worked out that essentially like the actual cost of the rocket was about 2% of what he'd been quoted when he started to break that down into kind of first core principles of what he would need to build that himself. And the kind of famous story now is that's how SpaceX was born. That basically he said, I'm going to build my own, I'm going to do it that way. And it's very similar to kind of how they've tried to build batteries for Tesla as well, in terms of making those cost effective, like building them themselves from those component parts. But this idea of working from first principles, and really applied to any of our work, first principles is simply breaking down, understanding the component parts of what we're working with. If we've got a complex system, and actually a lot of the work that I'm involved with, that my teams are involved with through the work that I do, actually that we're working on things that are inherently complex if it's to do with public support and public services policy. But actually, how do we start to interrogate what's really important? where are the first principles in those models we can work with to potentially configure something better? So that feels really important. And really simply, I've become quite well known for this blog post called Framing the Problem that I published 7 years ago now whilst working in government, which was basically 5 questions. So if you ever want encouragement that you should blog more and share your thinking, that blog post is basically the encouragement that you need. Like, people have found these 5 questions more useful than anything I've ever shared. I've put a lot of effort into other pieces of writing and talks, I can tell you. But really, this idea of framing the problem is what I call design questioning, and it's first principles. It's being willing to question the assumptions around our work, really frame the problem in a way that we're clear on what we're doing and why, starting from the right point. So just to take you through these, like, framing the problem is always really being prepared to ask, like, why are we actually doing this work? In a team, like in an agile team, why are we doing this work? Understanding the reasoning and motivation behind what we're doing. And then actually, who are our users? Can we describe who is actually going to use this product or service? What are our assumptions about that? And then you can start to ask questions like, have we actually gone out and talked to people, really understood their experience and their needs? And then the next question, like, being really clear, like, if we've really understood who needs to use this service, actually what outcome are we trying to deliver for people? And being really clear again on what we're working towards. And then the really important thing that I think goes unquestioned as well, and this is a first principle kind of problem to solve, it's the balance. It's what I call the balance between business needs and user needs. And there is always a tension, and it's a creative tension and a good tension, between what we're doing as an organisation, our goals, the way that we scale, become sustainable, become cost effective, become efficient, and actually delivering services, products that do a fantastic job of meeting people's needs, delivering positive outcomes. And there is always this kind of idea of, I call it like the problem in both hands. I can't do it today. I've got a microphone in my hand. But this idea of finding the balance of questioning from first principles, like, what is our motivation, reasoning for this work? And actually at the same time, what we try to deliver for people and centering people in our work. And then finally, like, first principles of actually how are we going to measure progress? So always knowing how we're going to measure what we're working towards as well. And it's a kind of design mindset of constantly having somebody in the room who's willing to ask these types of questions. Quite often we do it in a discovery at the start of a project, but I always find that it's almost like the true north kind of needle. It kind of gradually moves, and we have to be able to revisit these types of questions to bring that back constantly and align our work. So example number 4, and I told you these would be diverse. So example number 4 is the time traveler when we think about design. So most importantly for me, design is really part of the process of making things real. And I love conferences that have got a diverse range of designers, engineers, developers, because our work really is about making tangible things. Like, I really get frustrated by theory. Progress is made by putting real solutions into people's hands, responding and keeping going through iterative work, through actually continuous improvement, and essentially like the commitment to keep designing, keep improving over time. Like, design is never done. Design is the constant process of how we keep going. And I think this is maybe the superpower of design, is this idea of time travel. And this is sort of locked in my head, and I think it's a useful provocation. Because design is really good, if you apply it in the right way, of starting to imagine something that is essentially like, this is what the future could look like, and then starting to take that potential scenario and making it real right now for people to experience. And it's really the idea that if we can imagine something and be creative enough about something that's worth working towards, we can start to bring it into reality now in the way that people can experience it. And if people can experience it, it starts to make that change possible. And so I really love this idea, and it's kind of at the heart of all the work. I could have showed you many pictures. This is work with children's services in London boroughs, which is essentially looking at transforming how social workers work with families in kind of family court processes. And this is a kind of typical meeting of a social worker. There's a child in the room here who's kind of hidden in the corner. And we were really looking at how do you transform that interaction, because traditionally, like, a social worker will have to take lots of notes in a meeting, type them up in a system afterwards. We'd done lots of work that had showed in kind of research that social workers were spending, more than half their time actually just inputting data into systems. So we were experimenting with these tools of, what if we gave iPads with things like voice recognition to social workers, captured information automatically? What if those tools could actually be something that the kids in the room and the families could interact with directly, take photos on? That this is all a very different reality from the kind of processes, the IT legacy that defines social work at the moment. And what I'd say is like this picture is kind of a small piece of a new type of reality played out now. It's a future state that's been imagined. This is how it could work. And it's being prototyped. And actually, like, the technology isn't hard. Like the iPad, I think, had a lot of the native kind of functions we would need to use to start doing some of the things we wanted to test. In a way, it's kind of prototyping in a way where it's a bit kind of this idea of Mechanical Turk, where we're kind of faking the technology to test how it would work and evaluate it. But it's bringing the future into now, and that is really the superpower that I think is important. There's a really fantastic book, and I've quoted Rob Hopkins in the Multiply book. He's written From What Is to What If. And essentially, like, he runs kind of work that is very much about prototyping, working with communities. This idea of kind of looking at transforming physical communities in space. And like, he talks about this idea of actually, like, we work with people to create these possibilities of what the future could look like, which I find really exciting. But actually, it's really about how we start to bring that into the now. He's got one really great example in there, which I think brings this to life. I don't know if any of you have been involved with Extinction Rebellion. I mentioned the climate emergency earlier on. So this is quite close to where our TPX Impact office is in London, on London Bridge, and it was one of the protests in the last, I think this is within the last 12 months still. And essentially, Extinction Rebellion shut down the bridge. What was really interesting is they basically turned it into a public space. They brought plants and trees and put up skate ramps and create cycle lanes. And essentially, like, what this was, it was basically a prototype of the future world that they were actually protesting about, which I think is really fascinating. There's this kind of spirit of these types of demonstrations that sometimes we're maybe missing in design and our work, where actually we're starting to model the thing that we want to be reality. We're not just protesting, it's not just kind of theory and words, actually it's showing what that future could look like. And I think this could be as much part of like this type of kind of reality as it can be into the types of product services policy that we want to transform as well. And just as a final point here, I think there's another kind of aspect to this as well, and I find this really exciting. It's really the importance of storytelling. And there's another really fantastic book, and it's not a book you'd maybe expect me to quote. It's by Dr. Pippa Grange, called Fear Less. And she's a leading sports psychiatrist, and she worked famously, she was the person that worked with the England football team when we won a penalty shootout at the World Cup 4 years ago. So it got a lot of kind of attention at the time. But she talks about this idea that actually quite often we can't change the constraints or the circumstances. And it's this idea that the idea of shutting bridges, turning them into parks, still feels impossible, even though the climate emergency and actually really demands that type of response, yet we're not really willing to go there. But it's this idea, if we can't change the circumstances, we can change the story. And I kind of love this, and she talks about this idea of like, we can control our stories even when we can't control the circumstances. And I would even say, if you find yourself in a product team, in an organization, in a department, quite often we're not in control of the way that IT decisions, policy decisions, bureaucracy actually shapes what's possible. But we can start to shape the story of what's possible. And in a way, again, that's this kind of superpower of prototyping, of bringing a future reality into now. And what I would say is actually, like, part of the power of design or design thinking, which can be part of anybody's work, is really how we start to think about being better storytellers, being better communicators, finding people that can help us set out this future vision for what things could become like. So not just a future vision, a better story as well. So how do we do that? We can hire and work with designers that are great storytellers, or, like I say, work on these skills yourself. Quite often we design these kind of future visions for our products and services, but we don't communicate them very well. We don't bring them to life, and we just don't make them real enough that they then become reality. I wanted to make this point as well, and it was also said earlier today that there is this real danger of, like, we pull back to where we were before, like we become 2019 again in terms of the way that we we do our work and the impact it delivers. And what I would say is a lack of ambition, and there is a lack of ambition in government, especially at the moment, and it'd be very interesting to see what happens now in the next 6 months. But also when we see a lack of ambition, it's really, and I think it's a lack of creativity and imagination. Like more than ever, and this is the idea of multiplied, we have to question what's possible in the next decade. Like we all do some type of product, technology, design, delivery work. How does that work actually help transform society? What do we work on? How can our work actually extend the reach, extend how we challenge how we live our lives in terms of the biggest challenges in our lives and the biggest challenges facing society in the next decade. So just almost towards my last example, but the next one really, I wanted to talk about innovation, which is a funny word, isn't it? But I think design has to also challenge how we think about innovation if we think about this idea of doing more. So my next story is about this idea of like the true innovator. And another book I found, so final book recommendation is by Kat Holmes called Mismatch. And this is a book about inclusive design. And Kat was the principal director for inclusive design at Microsoft until about 2017. And I think her approach is really fascinating. And she talks about this idea of inclusive innovations not actually being a dramatic reinvention of the technologies that we have, the tools that we have. I actually think if we really look at what's possible in terms of the tools at our disposal, we have a fantastic set of opportunities to work with when we think about technology, how we use and work with data, how we use and work with machine learning, with AI. But all this stuff has to be done deliberately through an inclusive design process that involves the people that it's going to impact. And I love the way that Kat describes that really technology is about employing new perspectives to reframe the problems we need to solve. To maybe bring that to life, I'll give you one example. So this is about audio captioning. And I'm actually, I'm hard of hearing, so I use audio captioning, and I have done for a while. And audio captioning traditionally was for people like me who are deaf. You'd have it on your TV, or you kind of, traditionally that was its use case. Like the technology has been around for quite a long time. Like we've had captioned TV programs. But what's really fascinating is we now see use cases like if you go to a busy airport, if you sat in a bar and the news is on, like that'll be captioned, and actually that doesn't just help me who's deaf, actually it helps everybody because it's a noisy environment. That technology starts to apply a new use case. And we only start to really understand the possibility of that through research, through contextual understanding. There's a really good example as well. It already feels outdated, but I don't know if you remember Squid Games was the big thing on Netflix for a while. But it's fascinating now that like television that is actually not in English as a first language. I think most of us probably grew up thinking English is the default language for everything. But actually we now access content around the world, or content becomes accessible because of things like captions. And I know it was dubbed as well, but I know a lot of people actually chose to watch it in Korean with captions, so opening up content in new ways. And actually there's this nice example as well, you probably can't quite see here, but if I'm scrolling through Twitter now, like media, video is now a big part of social, the social content we consume. But actually we tend to watch that, like we don't want audio coming on when you're commuting on the train or you're walking into the office, like we read the captions. So what's really fascinating is the way that use cases evolve, even though the technology is fairly standard, fairly established. It's really like the technology isn't changing. What's changing is the design, the contextual understanding around that and how we start to apply that. And I think that's the really fascinating thing for me. And it really is about this investment in design. The value of design is understanding that context, understanding that possibility, that reach, and actually where that can go. So like I say, reinvention of context, and really how do we respond? So what I'd really like to just encourage you to do is start to think about like what could be possible. It's this idea as, again, like with the tools we've got, with the use cases we already have for the way that we use technology solutions, what could be made possible? How does that multiply if we start to look at new contexts and new use cases? And then just my final story, which I couldn't find a snappy title for, I apologize. But really a final story about constraints before I just want to pause for some questions. I think constraints are really, really important because design is really about learning to work with constraints. it's always as much as what you can do balanced with what you can't do, and finding creative ways to work through. Like I said before, how do we work with, like quite often in government, it's legacy technology decisions, you know, the things that have been in place for years that constrain how user experiences are delivered. How do we work with policy decisions that are sometimes difficult to implement, or actually we maybe don't even agree with? And actually, how do we just work with our own cultures in terms of the way our team dynamics work? So this is just a final story I really love. You might notice, you might recognize this one as Matisse. So Henri Matisse, very famous artist, he was really known as a kind of traditional, you know, modernist, not modernist painter. But actually his life really substantially changed in the last 20 years as he became quite severely disabled. And actually, this particular kind of example reminds me of constraints, and it's something I think about a lot as a designer. Like, how do we manage the constraints we're working with? And there's all the constraints I mentioned before, but also like even the commercial models we work with in our businesses. Like, how do we start to work around through with those? And I think that is, again, it's about more creativity. And what was interesting about Matisse is, so in the end of his life, he basically created these cutout prints. And he did this for about 20 years in the end, but basically his studio was set up in his bedroom. He hired assistants, and these are called cutouts because they're literally, he used to cut these shapes out of pieces of paper with a pair of scissors, quite often from his bedside. And then he'd direct people as they pin them on the wall. He produced these amazing prints. This is actually from, if you do know these, it was a Tate Modern exhibition in about 2014, I think it was, here in the UK. And so this idea that like he became a wheelchair user, like it was all after he'd had surgery for cancer. But what I think is fascinating is actually like it's now seen as the most creative part of his life, as the most constrained, most difficult part of his life. When he was actually severely restricted in what he could do, he had to work with those restrictions. And there are so many fantastic examples like this, of where actually this idea of less disability and more ability and what can you do becomes the question. And I just think it's a fantastic example of somebody adapting their work creatively. And whatever we do, whatever we work on, really it's always a question of like, can we be more creative? What can we do? What can we make possible? And always striving to do more. So I just wanted to go back to that very first quote. I really do believe in this equation that 2 + 2 can equal 5. That can be because of how we respond to the changes that are kind of forced upon us in our lives, the way that our work interacts with the world, the way that context changes makes more possible. And the idea that even the hardest problems to solve can actually then start to become our greatest opportunities. I do think that coming out of COVID, actually for the public sector, is a fantastic opportunity to reconfigure what's possible. We can take the pieces apart again, but we have to have the ambition and the willingness to do that. So just to summarize, like many aspects of our work can be multipliers. I've explored that a lot more in the book, and I'd really love more of you to read that if you're interested. I really do hope I've left you with some ideas about how we might shape that thinking in our work as well together. And also that just design is a good idea. Quite often it's recognizing what's missing. You know, are we able to be holistic? Are we able to really take a first principles approach? Are we being creative and visual enough? Are we really imagining, you know, creatively and ambitiously enough that future that we could work towards? And are we really willing to do the hard work to make it possible? So thank you. So if there's any questions, I think first 2 questions, I've got 2 books. So if you'd like one, that always works an absolute treat. I think gentleman at the back had his hand up first. So with the black t-shirt. Yeah, it's a really great question. So the question was, just to repeat it for everybody, it's really how do you deal with simplicity in complexity, really, like when we've got so many edge cases and like designing services that need to meet everybody's needs, I guess. Yeah, I always talk about like the importance is we don't see simplicity as the opposite of complexity. Like we're either doing complexity or we're doing simplicity. For me, the idea of applying simplicity is actually a way of working with complexity when we have all those edge cases. The ability to go back to first principles to really question what's important is really, that's applying simplicity as a mindset, but it's a tool. Quite often it's making those maps, it's making those artifacts that allow teams to make progress despite great complexity. What I would say in those models is, in terms of edge cases, we have to work much harder to make sure we're constantly trying to go beyond average use cases. So I'd always make sure, like in our work, we're thinking about actually how do we really build meaningful engagement with communities, user research with people that are going to be affected by the services, by the products that we're building. And I think that has to be a constant investment in terms of what we're working with as well. So yeah, it's all part of, like, research never stops. We're always searching for those edge cases. Didn't put it in the talk today, but quite often I talk about edge cases are actually the biggest opportunities, because it's where your services break. And we saw it in COVID, because quite quickly, a lot of solutions actually didn't reach everybody. Like, what do you do when you need to get food and medicine to everybody that's sheltering in really vulnerable situations? You know, they can't access the internet. So as well, like a lot of it really is how we design, you know, great online solutions, but we really think about whole systems, thinking about how services actually need to connect up with community organisations, how that reach actually runs into communities as well. So there's loads in that, but yeah, I'd love to talk more about that. We can. Would you like a book? Do you want to do the honours? Any other questions? I think somebody else had their hand up first. Yeah. And then we'll come to the
Thank
front.
you. Love the talk. Really appreciate it. Just on a practical basis, where do you start with some of this? Do you start with focus groups? Do you start with workshops? Do you start with whiteboards? I'm just interested to know, when you're really trying to start some of the engagement that you were talking about, what sort of practical tools do you tend to engage?
So can you repeat the question a bit with the microphone? So I am hard
Okay,
hearing.
I'm sorry. I could hear myself. It's a bit weird. Yeah, we're under the speaker. Great. So it was just a case on a practical basis of where do you start with. I loved everything you described, but what sort of tools and techniques do you use for some of the things you described? I was just saying, do you start with whiteboards, focus groups, mind mapping? What sort of techniques could we be employing to sort of take some early steps on this journey?
Yeah, no, great question. Yeah, so like the 5 questions are really good for kind of initial kickoff workshops. You can literally write those on a whiteboard or on a Miro board and have a discussion around those, get everybody to put their answers on post-its separately, you know, play back, look for themes, so you can use that as a tool. In terms of starting to take a holistic view, like, I'd really encourage you to look at kind of the idea of service mapping, like mapping out a user journey kind of one step at a time. Quite often in design processes, starting with a kind of as-is approach, like map out how something works at the moment from a real user's perspective, sit down with somebody and actually understand what they do when they interact with your product, and actually what do they do before that, which is quite often the extended service. How do they find it? How do they understand it's the right thing before they interact with it? What happens afterwards? Where are all the staff processes and the internal things that happen underneath that? You start to build these maps, but you can do that really effectively with post-it notes. Storyboarding is another one, like try and draw the kind of storyboard out on a whiteboard of, you know, get somebody that can sketch confidently and do that as a group as well. And you can get these sort of things can be worked up into kind of more visual artifacts as well. But yeah, mapping's a really great one. But I'd always say, like, do some real research, go talk to people, just ask open questions, try and understand what their experience is. If you can understand how it works now, that will start to give you opportunities to say, actually, like, there are kind of insights and opportunities here of how we might design it to work differently.
Thank you very much.
I think you've got a question at the front here, then another one there. Would you like a book?
Oh, I'd love one. Thank you.
Yes. Sorry. I was wondering, how do you practically harmonize the business outcome and the user outcome to kind of, do you take it like the user outcome leads to the business outcome, or how do you not balance but enhance that? Do you have any tips?
Great, really great question. Like, this is always a tension probably in all of our work at some point. So I mean, the important thing is to be honest and understand that balance. But quite often, nearly every brief that I kind of see that's public sector related has some level of wanting to improve user outcomes and needing to improve user outcomes, so services that work better for people, reach more people, work faster, more effectively. And if you balance that, quite often the ask is also like the understanding that there's an opportunity with digital, with technology, to create something that's more efficient, sustainable, scalable over time. So there's this question of how do we create actually a cheaper and more efficient service? How do we meet people's needs better and deliver a better outcome? And I actually think more often than not, in fact, I'd say nearly everything I've ever worked on, you can find the balance between those things. Because actually creating a service that creates a better outcome for somebody who works first time is about making something that's clear, understandable, can be used in terms of self-service by people that can actually access a service or achieve a goal for a service on their own. The amount of times you can remove the need for additional support through better design of things like questions, content, all of those things start to create business efficiencies because people aren't ringing phone lines, and actually we start to focus the effort and the time internally on people that do need additional support and the models around the service as well. So I think you have to find that balance, and what I always say is that idea again of holding the problem in two hands. So I think you have to hold on to both of those things tightly. Like there's always a commercial business reality, especially private sector, to how we're choosing to meet our customers' needs. But if in doubt, I think you lean into the user need. That's the thing. So if you're in a product team, if you're prioritizing, I think you've constantly got to be saying, well, this is the tension. But actually, if in doubt, we keep focusing back on actually, like, why does this service really exist? Well, it's to do this thing for this group of people. Because if that fundamentally doesn't work, actually, eventually the business won't solve its problems either. It won't create a sustainable model for itself. So I just never think they're separate, even having worked in big government departments, that have got, think that these things are far apart, but they're not in reality. We should see them as really, I want to build fantastic organizations as a designer. It's about fantastic staff experiences through the way we design with technology, and that then enables fantastic user experiences and outcomes as well. I should say as well, if you're interested in buying the book, it's on Amazon. All the profits from it are going to the NHS staff charities. So we're not making any money from it, but if you'd love to read it, then please do go and get a copy. Brilliant. Thank you very much.
Awesome. We have time for one more question. Gentleman.
I'll talk to you afterwards.
I wondered if you had any practical advice on implementing a product design team or a design system on an already mature product, an established organisation.
So implementing a design team?
Or a design system at an already established product company.
Yeah, so have you got designers at the moment?
That's exactly what I'm trying to do at the moment.
Have you got designers in the team at the moment?
We've just introduced half a dozen of them.
Yeah, so brilliant. That'd be like the first thing is start embedding some designers into like development teams and product teams. I think there's probably things you could do that would be really to build momentum. Like design sprints are fantastic. People aren't familiar, like the original kind of Google Venture design sprint of take a week. Like I used to work on a product called Free Agent many years ago now, and you could do a fire break for a week and actually bring everybody together to work through on a problem. So more rapidly, essentially define the problem on day one. So you do like the 5 questions kind of exercise, set out a future vision, develop a kind of feature, test it with some real users by kind of day 2 or 3. So you go through a whole kind of design process in a week to start to experiment with new ways of working. What I would say, like one thing that's been really effective in kind of public sector organisations, introducing user research. So as a team, like we used to do a thing at the Government Digital Service, we said everybody goes and watches 2 hours of research every 6 weeks, which I think is still a thing in a lot of government departments. But I basically use those designers, hopefully hire a researcher, but start to get some sort of lab, even in your own offices, get a little lab set up where you could dial real users in of the product. That I used to do it over like GoToMeeting a decade ago when we had a SaaS product that I was working on. Actually, everybody in the team starts observing people really interacting with the things that they're building and working on. And I think that just starts to shift the culture in terms of how people think about, actually, this is, there's something about the perception of your assumptions about how people interact with what you built, even if you're kind of automating testing, through to really deeply starting to observe how people use that and see how it really interacts with their work, if it's a product that supports their work or their day-to-day lives. But yeah, lots of things you could do.
Thank you.
Are we out of time?
Awesome. Yeah, we're out of time. Another round of applause
Thank you, everybody.
for Ben. Thank you so much.